So she's everywhere, isn't she? The former Prime Minister Liz Truss has released her new book, 10 Years to Save the West.
And last night she spoke with Nigel Farage on GB News. Here's what she had to say.
I was the only Conservative in the room for many years, and it's not working. You know, the West is weak. We're seeing authoritarian regimes on the rise, and what we're also seeing is in our own societies, our very values being undermined. You know, the things we believe in, our nation, the family, individual freedom, all of those core values are being undermined, and that is what my book is about. I hate being told what to do.
Yeah, I know.
And I hate the government telling other people what to do. And having spent 10 years in the government, I can tell you it genuinely doesn't know best. We've had a Whitehall that's been shaped by being in Europe, you know, essentially supplicants to Europe. And it's almost like, what is that syndrome when you become a hostage and you start to love Stockholm syndrome? Yeah. It's almost like that. You know, officials were constantly looking to Brussels for validation. And all of that needed to change.
Well, Tony Blair is... John McTernan is Tony Blair's former political secretary, and he was not impressed by what Liz Truss said last night.
Of course he wasn't.
The main thing, the big turn that came across was it was always somebody else's fault. Liz Truss was in the cabinet, eventually became Prime Minister, in the cabinet for 9 years. Tony was only in the cabinet for 10. And yet Liz Truss was unable to do anything. It was always somebody else's fault.
Now, is that a fair assessment, do you think, Andrew Pearce of Liz Truss? You've read the book, you've interviewed her about this.
I have read the book, and I've known her a long time, and I've read the book, and the book's quite interesting. She doesn't try and shift the blame to everybody else. She does blame a lot of other people, but she accepts things were done wrong. But she was, no doubt, the blob, the Treasury, got her. But if you sack the chief Mandarin on day one, that's a man called Tom Scholar, and don't have someone to replace him or her, you're in trouble.
Yeah, well...
And they were out together.
And she even has gone so far as to say it was the deep state that did for her. We're joined now by the political editor at HuffPost, Kevin Schofield, and the former MEP for London, Lance Forman. So this book is out this week, gentlemen. A lot of people discussing it. But does it really tell us anything that we didn't already know, do you think, about Liz Truss and how she will be viewed in history as the Prime Minister who was there for the shortest time, Kevin?
No, I mean, I think her views now are very well known. As you say, she has been absolutely everywhere. You can't open a paper or turn on the TV without seeing Liz Truss being interviewed. She's certainly very forthright in getting her message across. I'm sure it will do her book sales, maybe not in this country, but on the other side of the Atlantic, she'll probably do quite well. But, yeah, I mean, I'll pick up there on what Andrew said. You know, you're right, she got rid of Tom Scholar on day one, and I think that sort of set the scene for the next 49 days that she was in power. You know, she was in too much of a rush, trying to get everything done yesterday, and ultimately it blew up in her face. Although she is trying to shift the blame onto quite a lot of people, I think ultimately she only has herself to blame for that particular strategy.
Lance, she very much talks about the fact that there's nothing, she could achieve nothing. There were too many hurdles in her way. There were too many people. She almost talks about forces in her way to get a growth economy and to move away from what she sees as sort of left-wing ideology from all of the other countries as well that she mentioned in that interview with Nigel last night. Is she right?
I think she is right. I think we are living in this world where, you know, the forces, you know, the establishment, whether it's the Treasury, the Bank of England, and even a lot of her colleagues in the Conservative Party are just sort of stuck in this this world looking at sort of tax and spend the whole time without actually looking about the underlying incentives that make economies grow. And, you know, that's why our economy has stagnated for the last 30 years. It's really not that complicated. You know, if you want an economy to grow, what you have to do is incentivize people by having lower taxes and scrapping red tape. And red tape has got completely out of hand, tax levels at the highest they've been for a generation. And she wanted to change that. And I also think, you know, if you go back to and this wasn't about Brexit, but if you go back to the Brexit vote, I think there was a sense amongst the British people But they just felt that our country was stagnating, and they wanted to be bold and try something different. And yeah, they might have felt that, you know, pulling out of Europe was the thing we needed to do. But they wanted bold change, and we haven't had bold change in our leadership. And Liz Truss tried it, and unfortunately she was held back by her colleagues.
Why, but in your view, Lance, I mean, she only lasted 7 weeks. Humiliating, frankly. The shortest-serving Prime Minister in history. I think, unless there's a death, that record is never going to be beaten. So why did she fail so quickly, in your view?
You know, I wish she would have said the lady is not for turning when they sort of locked her in that room and said you need to reverse everything you've just done. She needed to show strength at that time, and she said, I mean, she's told me that the reason she was unable to was because she just didn't have the support of her parliamentary colleagues, despite the actual party sort of backing what she was trying to achieve. And it wasn't as though it was a great surprise. You know, people talk about this mini budget as a surprise. That summer hustings just went on, and she kept setting out what she was trying to achieve. People knew, and they voted for her on that basis. I think she was really badly let down by her colleagues that thought Rishi Sunak would do a better job. And actually, what we have now is, you know, he's performing, certainly in polling terms, even worse than she did at that time. So I think it was a huge mistake to get rid of her. They should have given her a much greater chance. And I think her policies were absolutely spot on. They were hailed by a lot of the newspapers. You know, the front pages said, "At last, a Tory budget." All the business groups, the CBI, the IOD, the Institute of Directors, the Federation of Small Businesses, they all said this is just the budget we need. And I'm a businessman. I agree. I thought it was a fantastic budget, and really, really unhappy that she was deposed.
Kevin Schofield, the Labour Party, indeed, in fact, even accepted one of her tax cuts. After that mini-budget. They don't talk about that very much now. But if you look at the polls, Rishi Sunak has plummeted to an approval rating of minus 27.5% in the latest poll on Conservative Home. That is an approval rating for ministers. No Tory leader has ever scaled such a low depth. So he's far less popular now than Liz Truss. They probably should have stuck with her.
Well, the whole thing about bringing in Rishi Sunak was he's supposed to be the sensible, moderate man in the room, that he would, stop the boat from rocking, and that the plan was that he was popular in the public, not least because of the furlough and all the money that he gave away to people during lockdown, and that he would then bring the Conservative Party's ratings up to where he was at, when in actual fact the opposite has happened. His ratings have plummeted down to where the Conservative parties are. People have had a look at him for the last 18 months and have decided that he's not up to the job. So I guess it's one of the great what ifs. You know, what if the Conservatives had stood by Liz Truss? What would have happened? I think, though, if you cast your mind back to that particular time, I think, you know, the momentum behind the moves to get rid of her were unstoppable. I remember at the Conservative Party conference, she'd only been leader for a few weeks, and already there was every Conservative MP you spoke to virtually was saying she's not going to last till Christmas. So really, she wasn't, if you want to defend her, you'd say she wasn't really given a chance. That said, I do think she was the author of her own misfortune.
Lance, would it have been better if she'd had a Chancellor of the Exchequer who'd actually worked in the Treasury before or been a Treasury Minister, or was that part of the strength? She was bringing somebody in who would look at it from a completely different perspective.
Look, to some extent, I feel she was stitched up by both the Treasury and the Bank of England. Yeah. The biggest problem here was the problem with the LDIs, the liability-driven investments, which she wasn't briefed on. Nobody in the Treasury briefed her about it. The Bank of England knew about this and never said a word. And the reason we know they knew was because their own pension fund had 100% of its investments invested in LDIs the summer before.
Just kind of interrupt you? Could you just explain in layman's terms what these are and why they were so significant and why it made such a bad impact on what she was trying to do?
Yeah, it is really important. It's difficult to explain in a soundbite, but essentially, after the crash in the early part of the 2000s, pension funds weren't allowed to invest in equity, in risk, what were considered to be risky investments. So they invested in bonds. And as we know, bonds just gave a very low rate of, it's basically like investing in a bank account. You get a very low rate of interest. And so they weren't earning enough money to be able to pay out people's pensions once they retired. So this new vehicle came along called an LDI. And what they said to the pension funds is, if you give us the security of these bonds, we will lend you more money to invest in more LDIs. And then if you give us the security of those LDIs, we'll lend you more money to invest in more. So it was like a giant Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, exactly.
And the problem with that, that enabled pension funds to earn more. But the problem is, when interest rates go up, and interest rates needed to go up because inflation was getting out of control because of what happened during COVID and Rishi Sunak, printing all this money and handing it out. So when interest rates go up, bond values go down because people want to sell the bonds they had because they can earn more money buying new bonds, which have a high rate of interest. So bond values were collapsing. Because they were collapsing and these pension funds were invested in them, they had to sell more bonds to pay off the ones that were collapsing and then sell more bonds. So you had a sort of Ponzi scheme that was crashing.
Yeah, and effectively her premiership became the victim of that very obscure, in a way, fiscal phenomenon. I'm so sorry, gentlemen, we've run out of time.